They started out 30 strong, 30 LSU journalism students and daily Reveille staffers. And of those 30, 7 would pay a hefty price for their belief in free speech and the right to a free press. They would forever be known as the Reveille 7, and of those 7, Stan Schlossman is the only person left to tell their story.
I'm the last one standing, and I don't stand very well.
But Stan Schlossman stood tall in the fall of 1934 when he was a journalism student just months from graduation. The Daily Reveille was just completing its printing of its Friday, November 16th edition. 4,000 copies had been printed when former Governor, now Senator Huey Long, happened upon a rough draft of the newspaper while visiting the state capitol. And that's where the story of the Reveille 7 begins. Helen Gilkinson, an acquaintance of Long's, happened to be reading a printer's proof of the Daily Reveille when the senator, home from Washington, asked to look at a copy of the newspaper. The edition included a letter to the editor from a business student denouncing a plan orchestrated by Long to enlist LSU students to nominate and elect an LSU football player to the Louisiana legislature. The writer called the move a ruse and a mockery of constitutional government and democracy. And even though he wasn't named in the letter, Long did not appreciate being disparaged in the student newspaper. He immediately called LSU President James Monroe Smith, a longtime political supporter, and ordered all copies of the edition of the Daily Reveille destroyed. Long then ordered a new edition of the paper to be printed, one that did not include the accusatory letter to the editor.
The school was highly politicalized.
The newspaper edition with the letter to the editor never saw the light of day, but from that day forward, Senator Huey Long tried to ensure that he or LSU President James Smith had a say in what was being printed by the students.
Huey was a cheap politician, that was all.
He was a dictator of the first water.
President Smith and Senator Long went as far as to have their ally, Helen Gilkinson, sit in an advisory position on the Daily Reveille staff. She also had the power to hire and fire as she saw fit. The administration simply saw this effort as faculty supervision, but the Reveille staffers and journalism students knew better. To them, it was outright censorship.
They were teaching us in journalism school freedom of the press. And at the same time, the politicians were trying to free the press. And they were, it was like two strings drawn, you know. One went one way, one went the other. They never got together.
This new policy was met with strict opposition by the students. They countered with a plan to place a memo on page 1 of every newspaper that stated, quote, "This issue of the Reveille has been approved by Miss Gilkinson prior to publication." President Smith and the administration strongly objected to the memo. After a meeting with administrators, Reveille editor James Catrier and several other Daily Reveille staffers were relieved of their positions at the student newspaper. Differences between the LSU administration and the journalism students came to a head several weeks later when a petition put forth by 26 journalism students to reinstate the dismissed Reveille staffers found its way into the hands of LSU faculty members and later to statewide newspapers. When President Smith retaliated by saying either recall the petition and apologize or be expelled, all but 4 students complied. Those 4, along with the 3 Reveille staffers from the original incident, would forever be known as the Reveille 7.
And we were the only ones who were left in the whole class. The rest of them agreed to do what they wanted them to do. And 7 of us didn't agree.
We stuck together as a group, and that was it. So.
The story of these 7 young men who had stood their ground against their university, as well as one of the most powerful politicians in the country, soon began to make its way across the nation. These students went from news writers to news makers, all because they believed in the constitutional right to a free press. And although they had been expelled, many other students and faculty silently lauded the journalists for standing up to the kingfish. In the wake of the controversy, the Reveille 7 were offered the opportunity to attend the University of Missouri, at that time one of the most prestigious journalism schools in the country, and eventually all 7 would earn their journalism degrees from that school.
The dean of the journalism school, Dean Frank L. Martin, somebody interviewed him and he said those boys would be welcome here. And so we took him up on it.
A few years after the Reveille 7 incident, LSU President James Smith would be found guilty of embezzling university funds. He tried to hide out in Canada, but eventually law enforcement caught up with him and returned him to Louisiana. And just before he was to be shipped off to state prison, he was greeted by members of the press at the New Orleans Lakefront Airport. Among them, a young newspaper man by the name of Carl Corbin.
He got up to the car and said to the president, "You don't remember me, do you?" He had interviewed him before. He said, "No." He said, "Well, I'm the one that interviewed you," and told him what date it was. And he said, "I just want you to know that I'm still here, but you're not."
Carl Corbin went on to a successful career in journalism, working as an editorial writer for several newspapers, as well as the Associated Press. The other 6 student journalists were content with whatever jobs they could find during the Great Depression. Several years later, in 1940, the next president of LSU, Paul M. Hebert, assembled a fact-finding commission to research the case of the Reveille 7. The committee concluded that the 7 students did not deserve their expulsions. All 7 were extended formal apologies and offered the opportunity to re-enroll at LSU, but by that time, it was too late. Schlossman says to this day he is not angry with LSU, and typical of those of his generation, says he's not really one for the limelight.
So that didn't make me a hero. Not in my book.
Over the last 8 decades, there have been other skirmishes between the Daily Reveille and LSU officials. That's the nature of the newspaper business. For all of its awards and accolades, no other LSU campus news story would be as colorful or as controversial as that of the Reveille 7.